Sarah Martinez adjusted her navy blue blazer as she approached Gate C-12 at Denver International Airport, her worn leather carry-on rolling behind her like a faithful companion. The blazer was from 3 years ago, purchased on sale at a department store, and it had become her uniform for Tuesdays and Thursdays, the days she flew to Salt Lake City for her job at the tower. At 32 years old, she developed a routine so predictable that she could have sleepwalked through it. But routine, she'd learned, was the scaffolding of ambition for people like her. The terminal was moderately crowded for a Tuesday morning in March 2019. Businessmen in expensive suits scrolled through their phones, checking stock portfolios and emails from their executives. Young families herded children toward the gate, the kids pressing their noses against the windows to watch aircraft taxiing across the tarmac. An elderly couple held hands, probably flying to visit grandchildren somewhere out west. Sarah noticed them all, cataloged them, and then faded back into invisibility, the way she'd perfected over 7 years. She approached the gate agent, a young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile. "Seat 7C, please," Sarah said, sliding her ID and boarding pass across the counter. It wasn't a request, it was a statement of fact. She'd booked the same seat for so long that she'd become part of the flight's infrastructure, like the beverage cart or the overhead bins. The gate agent didn't look surprised. She scanned the pass and handed it back. "You're all set, Ms. Martinez. Have a great flight." Sarah smiled politely but didn't engage further. She'd learned that conversation, while polite, took energy she needed for other things. Instead, she walked toward the jet bridge, her sensible travel shoes, the ones she'd bought specifically because they didn't show scuffs, making soft sounds against the polished floor. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-700, gleamed in the morning sunlight visible through the boarding tunnel. Sarah felt, as she always did, a small flutter of something that might be awe or might be envy. She was about to spend the next 2 hours inside one of humanity's greatest achievements, yet she would be sitting in economy class, watching the back of a seat in front of her, listening to other people's conversations and the white noise of the cabin. She found her seat, 7C, right side, above the wing, and settled in with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. Window seat, perfect for watching the flaps and slats during takeoff and landing, for observing the way the aircraft moved through the air, for studying the landscape below and imagining all the invisible highways of wind and pressure that held the plane aloft. Her carry-on went into the overhead bin, secured carefully so it wouldn't shift during flight. She withdrew her tablet and a worn aviation textbook, Aircraft Systems and Performance, 3rd edition, the margins filled with her careful notes and calculations. A businessman in 7B glanced over at her reading material and quickly looked away, probably assuming she was some kind of aviation nerd. He was right, though not in the way he meant. Sarah had been an aviation nerd since she was 7 years old, standing on her grandmother's back patio in Albuquerque, watching a regional jet climb toward the cumulus clouds forming above the Sandia Mountains. Her grandmother had said, "That's where your Uncle Carlos lives now. In the sky, practically." Sarah had been mesmerized. The idea that people could build machines to break free from the ground, to exist in that domain above the earth where only birds and clouds belonged, it had seemed like magic. By high school, Sarah had devoured every book about aviation she could find. By college, she'd pursued air traffic control as the most practical pathway toward a career in aviation. The salary was decent, good enough for someone without a wealthy family backing them. The benefits were solid. The job was essential, respected, stable, everything a sensible person should want. But Sarah had never wanted sensible. She'd wanted to fly. Air traffic control had been her compromise with reality. She was exceptionally good at it. Her supervisor Tom had told her multiple times that she had what he called the gift, the ability to hold multiple aircraft positions in three-dimensional space in her mind, to predict conflicts before they happened, to communicate with absolute clarity under pressure. She'd guided over 40,000 safe takeoffs and landings. Her voice had directed pilots through thunderstorms, equipment failures, and medical emergencies. And yet she was still on the ground. The cabin filled gradually as other passengers boarded. Sarah watched them pass her row without truly seeing her. The woman in 7A, a businesswoman with a crisp blazer and expensive luggage, didn't make eye contact. The flight attendant barely acknowledged her. The man across the aisle in 7D buried himself in a novel without noticing that someone intelligent and capable was sitting 3 feet away. This was Sarah's world. Competent, invisible, passing through spaces where people's stories intersected hers for exactly the duration of a flight before dispersing again. She pulled out her notebook, physical paper, because she preferred the tactile feedback of pen on paper, and began calculating. Her savings account, $17,340.63. The cost of 1 hour of flight instruction in a Cessna 172, $165 to $185, depending on aircraft rental and instructor rate. Hours already logged, 147. Hours needed for commercial pilot certification, approximately 250. Hours remaining, 103. Cost remaining, approximately $17,000 to $19,000. She was essentially 1 year away, maybe 2 if unexpected expenses arose, and they always did. The captain's voice came over the intercom, introducing himself and his crew with the professional courtesy of someone who'd said these words thousands of times. Sarah listened for the accent, the confidence level, the slight variations that told experienced controllers about a pilot's demeanor. This captain sounded methodical, slightly southern, probably in his mid-50s. The kind of pilot who followed procedures exactly and would be easy to work with from the tower. As the 737 pushed back from the gate, Sarah watched the ground crew release the aircraft with the same feeling she always had, a sense of transition from one reality to another. Up ahead, the jet bridge retracted. The tug vehicle towed them backward, and the Denver skyline rotated away from her window. She was 32 years old, flying the same route for the 700th time, studying the same materials, hopping for the same break that would finally let her become what she'd always known she should be. The other passengers around her had no idea that the quiet woman in 7C carried dreams large enough to lift her higher than this aircraft ever could. But dreams alone, Sarah had learned, didn't get you to altitude. Discipline did. Persistence did. Excellence in the small, invisible moments did. She opened her textbook and began reading about landing gear systems, mechanisms that would, in a few hours, become far more than just theoretical knowledge. The takeoff was textbook perfect. Southwest 447 accelerated down runway 35 left with steady, confident power, the engines producing that familiar deep rumble that Sarah had heard hundreds of times but never tired of. She watched through the window as the ground began to blur, the speed building with inexorable momentum. At exactly the right moment, the nose lifted, and that peculiar sensation of weightlessness washed through her body, not uncomfortable but profound. The wheels left the earth. They were flying. Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching Denver's sprawl diminish below them. The plane stretched out in geometric patterns, roads, fields, the grid of human organization imposed on the landscape. She could see the mountains to the west, the snow-capped peaks of the Front Range still brilliant white in the March sunshine. This view never got old. Every time she saw it, she felt something shift in her chest, a reminder of why she'd chosen this profession, why she dreamed of eventually piloting instead of just guiding. The aircraft climbed smoothly through 5,000 feet, 6,000 feet, 7,000 feet. The cabin pressure equalized gradually. Around her, passengers settled into the predictable rhythms of air travel. The businessman in 7B had already reclined his seat and closed his eyes. The woman in 7A was tapping away on her laptop, working on what appeared to be spreadsheets. Several rows back, a child was watching a movie on a personal screen. Two flight attendants moved through the cabin with their practiced efficiency, distributing drinks and snacks to the dozen passengers in coach. Sarah had her notebook open again, reviewing calculations for her upcoming flight hours. She had scheduled a dual instruction flight for the following Saturday with her instructor, Mike Patterson, at a small private airport outside Salt Lake City. It would be her 148th hour. She'd already plotted out the route, estimated the fuel burn, and mentally rehearsed the emergency procedures. This was how she prepared, methodically, obsessively, with the kind of attention to detail that some might call paranoid, but that she understood was simply professional. The flight attendant paused at her row. "Water, soda. We have apple juice, orange juice, coffee, tea." "Water, thank you," Sarah said, and the flight attendant moved on, leaving a small cup of ice water in front of her. Sarah sipped it slowly, her eyes returning to her textbook. She was reading about landing gear systems, the mechanical and electrical components that lowered and locked the wheels for landing. The timing seemed almost prophetic, though of course it was pure coincidence. At 11,000 feet, everything changed. It wasn't loud, that was what made it so distinctive. Sarah, with her ear trained by years of listening to aircraft systems from the tower, heard it immediately. A grinding sound, metallic and wrongly textured, emanating from somewhere below the cabin. Not the engines, that rumble was steady and predictable. Not wind noise, that came from a different frequency. This was mechanical, and it was wrong. The sound lasted exactly 8 seconds, then it stopped. Sarah's hand froze on her coffee cup. Her heart rate, which had been a steady 70 beats per minute, suddenly spiked. She set the cup down carefully and turned to look out the window, as if she might be able to see the source of the noise from the cabin. Of course, she couldn't. The wing filled most of her view, the bright white of the 737 skin, the complex network of surfaces and mechanisms she'd studied in textbooks but never physically examined. Was it the landing gear? The wheels shouldn't make that noise at altitude. They should be fully retracted, secured in their wells. The sound had come from somewhere forward and below, possibly from the nose gear mechanism. But it could also have been from the flaps, the slats, the hydraulic systems. Sarah's mind, trained through thousands of hours of listening to pilot-to-controller communications, began running through possibilities. She waited, her breathing was controlled, deliberate. Another 8 seconds passed, another 30 seconds, 2 minutes. The noise didn't return. Around her, no one had reacted. The businessman in 7B still slept. The woman in 7A still typed. The flight attendants continued their routine work. A passenger, too, rose back, laughed at something on their phone. The captain hadn't made an announcement. The first officer hadn't made an announcement. If there had been something seriously wrong, surely they would have said something by now. And yet Sarah knew, in that bone-deep way that comes from expertise and intuition, that something was wrong. She pulled out her phone and opened her aviation app, the one that allowed her to monitor live air traffic and radio frequencies. She'd paid the subscription fee months ago, a luxury she'd justified as professional development. Now, she cued into the frequency for Denver Approach Control and Salt Lake Approach, the radio voices crackling through her phone's speaker at low volume. Nothing unusual. Standard position reports, normal traffic, no emergency declarations, no mentions of Southwest 447. Maybe she'd imagined it. That seemed unlikely. Sarah had excellent hearing. She'd always scored in the 99th percentile on hearing tests, and she knew the difference between aircraft sounds and human imagination. She'd guided enough pilots through equipment failures to recognize when something was actually malfunctioning versus when anxiety was playing tricks. She tried to return to her studying, but concentration was impossible. Her mind kept replaying that 8-second window of sound, analyzing it, dissecting it, trying to understand what her ears had detected. The grinding quality suggested metal-on-metal contact, something rubbing or scraping against something else. The duration suggested whatever it was, the system had compensated or the condition had resolved. But why? 40 minutes into the flight, cruising at 33,000 feet, the aircraft was performing normally. The ride was smooth. The engines maintained their steady thrum. Sarah had heard no other unusual sounds. Maybe it had been something minor, a mechanical fluctuation that the aircraft's redundant systems had automatically corrected. Aircraft were engineered with layers of backup systems for exactly this reason. They were designed to handle failures gracefully. But Sarah knew something the other 162 passengers on this flight didn't know. Aircraft systems didn't make random grinding noises unless something was actually wrong. Her expertise, the 7 years of listening to pilots describe equipment issues, the hundreds of flights she'd monitored from the tower, all of it told her that Southwest 447 had just experienced a mechanical anomaly. She pressed her forehead against the window again, watching the wing cut through the thin air at 510 miles per hour. Somewhere in the structure of this aircraft, beneath panels and casings, something wasn't quite right. And as far as anyone else knew, everything was perfectly normal. Sarah opened her phone and checked her email. Nothing from her supervisor. No emergency alerts from the FAA. The flight continued westward, carrying 163 people towards Salt Lake City at an altitude where the air was thin enough that unassisted human lungs would begin to fail within minutes. She closed her eyes and waited, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was waiting for. 1 hour and 40 minutes into the flight, the captain's voice came over the intercom with that practiced calm that experienced pilots cultivated. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Salt Lake City. We'll be starting down in just a few moments. Current time in Salt Lake is 2:15 p.m. Weather is clear with visibility of 10 miles. We should have a smooth descent. Thanks for flying with us today." Sarah noted the time. They were on schedule. The grinding noise she'd heard earlier had never repeated, and the flight had proceeded without incident. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe it had been nothing, some minor mechanical fluctuation that the redundant systems had handled automatically, exactly as designed. It was possible. Aircraft were built to be resilient, to handle anomalies and keep flying. But Sarah had learned that possible and actually happened weren't the same thing. She reopened her aviation app, increasing the volume on her phone speaker just slightly, nestling it against her ear as if she were listening to music. The frequency for Salt Lake approach control crackled with voices, pilots announcing their positions, controllers issuing clearances and vectors, the constant professional symphony of air traffic management. Then she heard it, her supervisor's voice, Tom Richardson, the senior controller at Salt Lake City Tower, speaking to an inbound flight. His tone was normal, routine, exactly as she'd heard it hundreds of times from the other side of the radio. Southwest 447 had just reported to Salt Lake approach. Sarah's hands tensed. She waited, listening to her colleague's response, to the radio exchanges that would indicate whether everything was normal or whether they'd reported an issue. Tom's voice came back. "Southwest 447, Salt Lake approach, radar contact. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Expect runway 16 left for landing." The captain acknowledged. "Southwest 447, descending to 240, expecting 16 left." Standard, normal, routine. Sarah released the breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. But then, 30 seconds later, something changed. A new voice came through her phone speaker. She recognized it as Bill Chen, the approach controller who worked the handoff sector. He sounded different, tense. "Southwest 447, we're going to need you to report any maintenance issues or unusual indications you may have experienced since departure." That wasn't standard radio phraseology. That was a specific request, made for a specific reason. Sarah's entire body went rigid. The captain responded, his voice still calm but with a new undertone of seriousness. "Salt Lake, Southwest 447. We experienced a mechanical sound during climb approximately 30 minutes ago. Brief grinding noise, single occurrence, no recurrence since. All systems appear nominal. Can you advise? There was a pause, longer than normal. Sarah could imagine what was happening in the tower right now. Multiple controllers checking the flight's information, looking at the aircraft's type and registration, checking maintenance records, trying to determine what that single grinding noise might have been. When Tom's voice came back, it carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Southwest 447, copy your report. We'll need to make arrangements for a visual inspection on landing. Continuing you on approach. Sarah's mind was running through possibilities at lightning speed. A mechanical sound during climb. The landing gear, most likely, that fit with what she'd heard, the location, the timing. But why were they asking about it now? Why the careful routing? Unless... Tom's voice came back again, but this time he wasn't speaking to the aircraft. He was speaking to someone in the tower. Sarah heard the background chatter change, heard what sounded like him turning to another controller. Get me the roster from this morning's Denver operations. I need to know who's on Southwest 447. Sarah's heart stopped. She watched the cabin around her, suddenly aware of every person, every seat, every face. The businessman in 7B was still asleep. The woman in 7A was closing her laptop. No one was looking at her. No one knew that the quiet woman in row 7 was listening to encrypted frequency broadcasts on her personal device, monitoring the exact same radio system she used from her controller's headset at the tower. In the tower, Tom was doing something, searching, looking, asking questions. Then a new voice broke through, a voice she recognized as Captain James Morrison, the pilot of Southwest 447. His transmission was directed to Salt Lake approach, but it sounded different now, more formal, more official. Salt Lake, this is the captain of Southwest 447. We have someone on board, a controller, someone from your facility. We need to know if that person is available. We may need their expertise on approach. Sarah's hands were shaking. She gripped the armrest to steady them. Tom's voice came back, and she heard emotion in it now, excitement mixed with concern. Southwest 447, stand by. The frequency went quiet except for routine traffic from other aircraft. Sarah sat in her seat, her body rigid, her breathing shallow. They were looking for her. They wanted her. But how did they know she was on this flight? Her roster information wouldn't automatically be part of the Southwest 447 passenger manifest visible to air traffic control. There had to be. Of course, someone had recognized her. One of the flight attendants, perhaps, or the captain who might have reviewed the passenger list. She'd never considered that her name might stand out to pilots. Sarah Martinez, flying the same route every week, sitting in the same seat, living a life so routine that she'd become invisible not just to passengers but to the entire system. Until something went wrong. Then a voice cut through the static, not Tom's but someone else, another controller. Sarah recognized the tone of someone accessing a computer, pulling up information. We have it. Sarah Martinez, call sign Echo 9, Junior Air Traffic Controller, Salt Lake Tower Operations. She's been with us for 7 years. Echo 9. Her call sign, the designation she used on the radio, the name through which she communicated with hundreds of pilots, was being broadcast across the frequency where anyone monitoring could hear it. Captain Morrison's voice came back, clearer now with audible relief. Salt Lake, Southwest 447 confirms. Echo 9 is on board. We're going to need her. In row 7C, Sarah felt the entire weight of 7 years compress into a single moment. All those invisible flights, all those routine commutes, all those hours spent studying and preparing and dreaming, suddenly materialized into a moment where she was necessary, where her expertise wasn't theoretical or aspirational, where the 7 years of quiet competence had prepared her for exactly this situation. She was no longer invisible. A flight attendant appeared at her row, leaning down with confusion and something like awe in her expression. Ms. Martinez, are you? Are you a pilot? Air traffic controller, Sarah said quietly, her voice steadier than her hands. I work in Salt Lake City. The flight attendant's eyes widened. The captain wants to see you, in the cockpit, right now. Sarah carefully gathered her materials, her notebook, her textbook on aircraft systems. Around her, several passengers had heard the exchange and were now staring at her with newfound interest. The businessman in 7B had woken up. The woman in 7A was watching with curiosity. Sarah stood, straightened her blazer, and moved toward the cockpit door. She'd spent 7 years waiting for her moment. Now it had arrived at 33,000 feet, somewhere over western Colorado, in an aircraft with a mechanical problem that only she might be able to help solve. The cockpit door had always been an imaginary boundary for Sarah. She'd guided thousands of aircraft from the tower, communicated with hundreds of pilots through that barrier, but she'd never physically stepped through it. The door itself looked surprisingly mundane, thick, reinforced with security protocols, but still just a door. Captain Morrison opened it from inside, and the smell of the cockpit hit her immediately. A combination of electronics, recycled air, and something uniquely aviation. The particular odor of high-altitude pressure systems and thousands of hours of operation. Sarah, thank God, Morrison said, his weathered face creased with genuine relief. He was taller than she'd expected from his voice alone, with silver hair and the kind of posture that came from decades of sitting in a pilot's seat. He extended his hand without formality. I'm Captain James Morrison, First Officer Lisa Chen. We've got a situation that requires your expertise. Sarah shook both their hands, hyper-aware of how her civilian clothing contrasted with their sharp uniforms. The first officer, a woman who appeared to be in her early 40s with focused dark eyes, nodded in acknowledgement and gestured toward the center console. We experienced a mechanical anomaly during climb, Morrison explained, not wasting time on pleasantries. Roughly 30 minutes after departure, a grinding sound, duration approximately 8 seconds, then ceased. We've run every diagnostic we can remotely, and we're getting conflicting data on one critical system. He pulled up the flight deck display with the ease of someone who'd performed this action 10,000 times. The screen showed multiple parameters and readouts, but Sarah's attention locked immediately onto one, the landing gear status indicator. Our nose gear sensor is giving us inconsistent readings, Morrison continued, pointing to the telemetry. The primary indicator shows deployed and locked, but we're also getting intermittent electrical signals from the backup sensor that suggest possible mechanical interference with the locking mechanism. Sarah leaned forward, her analytical mind shifting into overdrive. The display showed waveforms and digital readouts that told a specific story. How long have you been getting these false signals? She asked, then immediately corrected herself. I mean, intermittent signals from the backup sensor. Morrison's eyes revealed a flicker of something, surprise perhaps that she'd asked the exact question he would have asked. 40 minutes, started about 10 minutes after we heard the noise. They come and go every 2 to 3 minutes. Doesn't fit any standard failure pattern. Lisa Chen, the first officer, spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the precision of someone trained for emergencies. We've tried cycling the gear, running through all emergency procedures. Nothing changes the readout pattern. The primary sensor is solid, shows deployed, but the backup is unreliable and we can't visually confirm from here. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was textbook uncertainty, not a clear-cut failure, but a situation where the aircraft's automated systems were providing contradictory information. It was precisely the kind of scenario that had no predetermined solution, that required human judgment and expertise. Where are you in the descent? Sarah asked. Just past 15,000 feet, Morrison said. We've got approximately 35 minutes until we need to be committed to landing. If we're not confident in the gear, we have a few options, none of them good. We can attempt to land anyway and hope the gear is actually deployed, which puts us at risk of a gear-up landing. We can divert to another airport with better equipment for inspection. Or we can get visual confirmation before we reach landing, Sarah finished, her mind already working through the geometry and possibilities. Salt Lake has runway 16 left with the longest visual approach corridor in the state. If we come in low and slow enough, ground crews can see the nose gear from below, confirm actual physical deployment. Morrison and Chen exchanged a look, one of those silent communications that existed between experienced pilot teams. "That's what we were thinking," Morrison said, "but it requires coordination that's unconventional, and we need someone in the tower who understands both the technical requirements and can sell this to the approach controller, someone they trust." The implication hung in the air. Sarah was that person. She was the bridge between the cockpit and the tower, someone who understood the constraints and limitations of both sides. "How long have you been flying?" Sarah asked. 37 years, Morrison said. "You?" "Never commercially. 147 hours student pilot." Sarah paused, then added with quiet honesty, "But I've guided approximately 40,000 safe landings from the tower, and I've handled 17 emergency situations, including 3 landing gear issues." Morrison nodded slowly, something shifting in his assessment of her. This was no longer just an air traffic controller who happened to be on the flight. This was someone with actual operational experience, someone who understood both the physics of flight and the protocols of emergency management. Lisa Chen spoke up. "The main question is whether we can actually execute this plan without violating too many procedures. Getting you involved in flight operations is already pushing the boundaries." Sarah moved to a point where she could see both the flight display and through the forward windows. Below them, the landscape was still relatively flat. They were passing over Utah's eastern plains, with the Wasatch Mountains visible in the distance. The sky was clear, visibility excellent, perfect conditions for a visual inspection. "Here's what I'm thinking," Sarah said, her voice taking on the authority of someone who'd made hundreds of critical decisions. "We coordinate with ground control directly. I call up to Salt Lake Tower while we're still at a safe altitude, brief them on the situation, and request that we execute a low-level approach over runway 16 left. Have ground crews positioned with binoculars on the active runway. They visually confirm gear deployment while we're at approximately 2,000 feet. If it's deployed and locked, we land normally. If there's a problem, we still have altitude to execute a go-around." Morrison was nodding, his expression showing both respect and calculation. "And the risk? If the gear isn't deployed and we're only at 2,000 feet when we find out, we have limited options for diverting," Sarah said honestly. "But the alternative is landing without confirmation, which carries a worse risk profile. And we've got excellent weather, excellent visibility, and an excellent airport layout for this procedure." Lisa Chen leaned back in her seat, her voice steady. "I think it's our best option, Captain." Morrison met Sarah's eyes directly. This was the moment of trust, the moment where he decided whether to defer to this woman who, minutes ago, had been invisible in seat 7C. "All right, Echo 9, he said, using her call sign deliberately, acknowledging her not as a passenger but as a fellow professional. "Let's save this flight. First, we need to get you set up with a headset so you can coordinate with the tower. Then we bring them into this plan." Sarah moved to the jump seat, the third position behind the 2 pilot seats traditionally reserved for observers or additional crew. A headset was placed on her head, and suddenly the frequency that she'd been monitoring on her phone came through crystal clear and intimate. Not a broadcast anymore, but a conversation she could participate in. "You ready?" Morrison asked. Sarah took a breath and nodded. "Ready." It was the most honest answer she'd ever given. The jump seat was positioned perfectly. Sarah could see both the flight displays and the forward view through the windscreen. Morrison had angled slightly toward her while maintaining his primary attention on the aircraft's flight path. The headset felt strange on her head, heavier than she'd expected, but the audio clarity was remarkable. She could hear every nuance of the radio traffic, every controller's tone, every other aircraft's position report. "All right," Morrison said, his voice steady and methodical. "Walk us through what you're thinking. Start with the technical assessment." Sarah organized her thoughts, speaking with the precision of someone who'd explained complex scenarios to pilots hundreds of times. "The grinding noise you heard correlates with landing gear extension and retraction cycles. The duration, 8 seconds, matches the typical timing for nose gear deployment. The fact that it happened once and hasn't recurred suggests either a mechanical interference that's self-corrected or an electrical anomaly that triggered the system to compensate." Lisa Chen was nodding along, her eyes tracking the altitude and descent rate, which would explain why the primary sensor shows deployed and locked, but the backup is giving intermittent signals. Something's physically wrong, but the gear might actually be down. "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "The backup sensor is intermittent, which in my experience suggests either an electrical connection issue or actual mechanical binding in the locking mechanism. But binding doesn't necessarily mean the gear isn't deployed. It might just mean the locking pin isn't perfectly seated." Morrison leaned back slightly, his jaw working as he considered the implications. "So your assessment is that the gear is probably down, but we can't be certain from the cockpit." "That's my assessment, yes," Sarah said. "And that puts us in a position where we either land blind and hope for the best, or we find a way to confirm actual deployment before we're committed to landing." "Which brings us to your low-altitude approach idea," Morrison said. He pulled up a navigation display showing their current position and the approach corridor to Salt Lake City. "Talk me through the geometry." Sarah leaned forward, studying the display. Salt Lake City International Airport sat in a valley surrounded by mountains, which created specific approach corridors for aircraft coming from different directions. Runway 16 left, the runway they'd likely be assigned, had an approach path that descended over relatively flat terrain before reaching the threshold. "If we request a low-level visual approach," Sarah explained, "we can request vectors for approximately 2,000 feet above ground level on a long, shallow descent over the runway. At that altitude, ground crews with binoculars positioned along the runway can see the nose gear from below. The main landing gear will already be visible, obviously, but the nose gear is what's concerning us." Lisa Chen's eyes flicked to the altitude readout. "We're currently at 14,800 feet and descending. How much time do we have to set this up?" "Roughly 30 minutes until we need to begin our initial descent to landing altitude," Sarah said, "which gives us adequate time to coordinate with the tower, brief them on the procedure, and ensure ground crews are positioned." Morrison was quiet for a moment, running through the scenario in his mind. Sarah had seen this expression on pilots' faces before, that particular concentration of experienced professionals working through emergency procedures. Finally, he spoke. "What's the risk profile?" Sarah appreciated that he asked this directly. No hedging, no false optimism, just a professional evaluation of danger. "Significant," Sarah said honestly. "If the gear isn't actually deployed and we don't discover it until we're at 2,000 feet, we have limited time to divert to an alternate airport. We could attempt a go-around, but at that low altitude with potentially compromised gear, we'd be in a vulnerable position. However," she continued quickly, "the alternative risk profile is arguably worse. If we land without confirmation and the gear isn't deployed, we're looking at a belly landing with 163 people on board." The cockpit fell silent except for the steady hum of the engines and the soft crackle of the radio. "I'd rather have bad options that we actively manage," Lisa Chen said quietly, "than bad options that we just hope turn out okay." Morrison nodded in agreement. "All right, let's assume we go forward with this plan. What do we need from the tower?" Sarah had already been thinking through this. "First, we need an approach controller willing to deviate from standard procedures. Second, we need ground crews positioned on or near runway 16 left with visual confirmation capability. Binoculars, cameras, someone who can call back what they see clearly. Third, we need emergency services on standby, which they probably are anyway given the circumstances. And fourth, we need clear weather and visual conditions, which we currently have. What about obstacles in our path? Morrison asked. Terrain, other traffic, approach path obstructions. Runway 16 left is the longer of the two main runways, Sarah said, calling up mental maps of Salt Lake City Airport that she'd studied extensively. The approach from the south is clear of obstacles. We'd be descending over relatively flat terrain. As for other traffic, approach control can clear the airspace ahead of us. We'd essentially be getting priority handling, which they'll grant immediately once they understand the situation. Lisa Chen was making notes on a pad, her hands steady despite the implications of what they were planning. What's our abort criteria? At what point do we say this isn't working and divert? Sarah appreciated the question. If we reach 1,000 feet and don't have visual confirmation from ground crews, we abort. We climb to a safe altitude, declare an emergency if necessary, and divert to an alternate airport with maintenance facilities, probably Phoenix or Las Vegas. Flight time to Phoenix, Morrison asked. Approximately 2 hours, Sarah said, with fuel status. We're at 60%. No problem getting to Phoenix, Lisa confirmed, checking the fuel display, or anywhere in the southwest. Morrison nodded, then turned his attention to the radio. He keyed the transmitter, his voice taking on a different quality, more formal, the voice of a captain briefing approach control on an emergency situation. Salt Lake approach, this is Southwest 447, he said. We need to discuss our approach strategy. We have an air traffic controller on board from your facility who's providing technical guidance on our mechanical situation. There was a pause, then Tom Richardson's voice came through the headset, Sarah's supervisor, his tone shifting to match Morrison's formality. Southwest 447, go ahead. Sarah's heart was pounding. This was the moment where their plan either gained traction or fell apart. We're proposing a low-level visual approach over runway 16 left, Morrison said calmly, approximately 2,000 feet above ground. Our controller will coordinate with your ground crews for visual gear confirmation before we commit to landing. Is this something your facility can support? Another pause. Sarah could imagine the conversation happening in the tower, controllers looking at each other, supervisors being called, emergency procedures being reviewed. Then Tom's voice came back, and Sarah heard something in it that gave her confidence. It was the sound of a professional making an executive decision in favor of a well-reasoned plan. Southwest 447, we can support that approach. Stand by for coordination. Sarah, are you still on the frequency? Sarah's mouth was dry. She keyed the transmitter, using the practiced calm she'd cultivated over 7 years of tower operations. Tom, this is Echo 9. I'm in the cockpit with the captain and first officer. We've developed a procedure that I believe gives us the highest probability of safe landing with maximum information certainty. Understood, Echo 9, Tom said, and she heard respect in his voice. Let's make it work. What do you need from us? Sarah looked at Morrison, who nodded. She was no longer a passenger. She was no longer invisible. She was now the critical link between the sky and the ground, between uncertainty and resolution. I need ground crews positioned with visual confirmation capability, Sarah said. Binoculars and cameras if possible. I need them ready to call back what they see when we're at approximately 2,000 feet on final approach. And I need clear air traffic separation so we can execute this approach without conflicts. Copy that, Echo 9, Tom said. We'll make it happen. Welcome to the operation. Sarah set down the transmitter and looked at Morrison. We're committed now, she said. The captain smiled, a real smile, not the practiced professional courtesy. Yes, we are, And I'm damn glad you're here. Salt Lake City Tower was a controlled chaos of activity, though to untrained observers it might have looked deceptively calm. Tom Richardson stood in the middle of the operations floor, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapidly to the airport operations manager. Around him, 6 air traffic controllers sat at their radar scopes and radio positions, each monitoring different aspects of the airspace. But every conversation, every action was now coordinated toward a single objective: getting Southwest 447 safely on the ground, with visual confirmation of its landing gear status. "We need ground crews on runway 16 left immediately," Tom was saying into the phone. "Binoculars, cameras, whoever you can get. Position them at the 4,000-foot marker and the 6,000-foot marker so they have clear sight lines underneath the aircraft as it passes overhead." The operations manager's voice crackled back. "Copy that. I'm mobilizing the equipment crew now. ETA 3 minutes for positioning." Tom hung up and turned to his senior approach controller, Bill Chen, who was already reshuffling traffic patterns. "Clear the approach corridor for 16 left," Tom instructed. "I want minimum separation below Southwest 447. They're coming in on a low-level visual approach." "Already working it," Bill confirmed, his fingers moving across the radar scope with practiced efficiency. "I'm vectoring American 342 to hold north of the airport, pushing United to a 15-mile final on 34 right. Southwest 447 will have a clean corridor." The radio crackled with position reports from other aircraft, but Tom's focus was entirely on the one that mattered. He keyed his headset to speak directly to Sarah, his voice carrying both the authority of a supervisor and the reassurance of someone who trusted her judgment implicitly. "Echo 9, Salt Lake Tower. Ground crews are being positioned now. We'll have visual confirmation capability within 5 minutes. What's your current altitude and ETA?" Sarah's voice came back through the headset, clear and professional but with something underneath, the weight of responsibility. "Salt Lake, Southwest 447 is currently at 12,400 feet, descending at 1,200 feet per minute. We're estimating initial descent point in approximately 12 minutes. That'll give us time to brief the crews and ensure positioning is complete." "Copy that," Tom said. "We'll have you set up and ready." He turned to look through the tower windows toward runway 16 left. From this vantage point, the runway stretched out before the tower like a gray ribbon, lined with approach lights. The day was clear, visibility unlimited, exactly what they needed. He could already see a truck moving along the runway apron, heading toward the position markers where ground crews would stand to observe the aircraft's landing gear. Tom had been in air traffic control for 23 years. He'd handled countless emergencies, managed weather diversions, coordinated with aircraft experiencing mechanical failures. But this was different. This was one of his own controllers, someone who'd worked beside him in this tower for 7 years, now in the cockpit making critical decisions about how to safely land an aircraft with questionable landing gear. He'd known Sarah was exceptional. Her voice on the radio had always carried clarity and precision. Her decisions were always sound. But this was another level entirely. She'd somehow positioned herself at the exact intersection of expertise and opportunity, a person who understood both the limitations of automated systems and the human capability to work around them. Another controller, Marcus Webb, called out from his position, "Ground crews are in position. Both locations, visual confirmation ready. They're reporting clear sight lines." "Excellent," Tom said. He keyed the radio again. "Southwest 447, ground crews are positioned and ready for visual confirmation. You're cleared to begin your descent to approach altitude." In the cockpit, Sarah heard the message and felt a surge of relief. The plan was coming together. The tower was executing their part flawlessly. Now it was up to Morrison and Chen to fly the approach with precision while she orchestrated the coordination between cockpit and ground. Salt Lake, Southwest 447, Morrison responded. Beginning descent now. Descending from 12,400 feet. We'll level off at 4,000 feet and request vectors for the visual approach to runway 16 left. Sarah watched the altitude tape on the flight display, seeing the numbers decrease. 12200 12,000, 11,800 feet. The aircraft banked slightly as Morrison adjusted course toward the approach corridor. Her hand hovered near the radio selector, ready to assist with any communications that required her specific knowledge of Salt Lake City's layout and procedures. Lisa Chen was handling the descent checklist, her voice precise and methodical. Descent checklist complete. Approach brief complete. Landing gear. She paused, looking at the conflicting sensor readings. Status remains uncertain. Sarah leaned forward, watching the readouts. The primary sensor still showed deployed and locked. The backup sensor continued its intermittent signaling pattern. Nothing had changed, which in some ways was reassuring. At least the situation wasn't deteriorating. "We'll know in about 15 minutes, Sarah said quietly. The aircraft continued its descent, bleeding altitude as it approached the approach zone. Tom watched the radar scope, seeing Southwest 447's target symbol moving down the approach path. He'd handled thousands of aircraft movements on these scopes, but this one required his undivided attention. Southwest 447, Salt Lake approach, Bill Chen's voice came through the radio. Descend and maintain 4,000 feet. We're vectoring you for a long, shallow approach to runway 16 left. Expect visual approach clearance in approximately 10 minutes. Southwest 447, descending to 4,000, understanding visual approach to 16 left, Morrison acknowledged. Sarah keyed her headset to speak to Tom in the tower, her voice private now, not broadcast to other aircraft. "Tom, I'm in the cockpit with the captain and first officer. Once we reach 2,000 feet on final, I'm going to coordinate with the ground crews. You'll hear me calling out our position and requesting visual confirmation. I need the ground crews to be very specific about what they see. Gear condition, extension level, any visible damage." "Understood, Sarah," Tom said, and she could hear the weight of leadership in his response. "You're calling the shots now. Whatever you need, we provide." The aircraft was now at 9,000 feet, still descending steadily. From the cockpit windows, Sarah could see the landscape becoming more defined. The mountains to the east were visible now, the city sprawling below them. The Salt Lake Valley opened up beneath them, the Great Salt Lake glinting in the afternoon sunlight beyond the airport. Morrison glanced back at Sarah. "How are you doing?" "I'm focused," Sarah said simply. And it was true. The nervousness had transformed into something else, a kind of crystalline clarity that came from being exactly where expertise met necessity. "Good," Morrison said. "That's what we need." The altitude continued to decrease. 8,000 feet, 7,000 feet, 6,000 feet. They were approaching the point where they would level off at 4,000 feet and begin the long visual approach. Sarah could feel the aircraft's orientation changing as Morrison banked slightly, following the vectors that Bill Chen was providing from approach control. In the tower, Tom was watching the radar scope with intense focus. On his screen, Southwest 447 was a bright target slowly descending toward the airport. Around it, he'd cleared all other traffic. The airspace was dedicated entirely to this single aircraft and its critical approach. Southwest 447 is now 5 miles from the outer marker, Bill Chen reported, descending through 6,000 feet. Sarah transmitted, "Salt Lake, Southwest 447. We're coming down the approach path now. Ground crews prepare for visual confirmation in approximately 8 minutes. We'll be passing overhead at 2,000 feet. "Ground crews standing by," came a voice from the runway, the lead ground crew chief. "We have binoculars, cameras, and clear sight lines. Ready when you are." The aircraft leveled off at 4,000 feet, now in a stable descent toward the airport. The runway was visible now through the windscreen, still distant but growing more defined with each passing minute. Sarah felt her hands grip the armrests of the jump seat, not from fear, but from the intensity of focus. This was the moment. In the next few minutes, they would either confirm that Southwest 447's landing gear was safely deployed, or they would discover a catastrophic problem that would require immediate action. Everything depended on what happened in the next 8 minutes. The aircraft descended smoothly through 3,500 feet, the runway growing larger with each passing second. Sarah watched the altimeter wind down, a mechanical readout that clicked off hundreds of feet with inexorable precision. The nose of the 737 was pointed directly at runway 16 left, the approach path perfectly aligned, the descent rate steady and controlled. Outside the windscreen, the Salt Lake Valley spread out below them in geometric precision. Streets, buildings, vehicles moving like insects, the entire infrastructure of human civilization miniaturized by altitude. "We're 3 miles from threshold," Lisa Chen called out, her voice carrying the professional composure of a first officer who'd executed this maneuver hundreds of times, though never quite like this. 2,500 feet, descent rate 150 feet per minute, stabilized approach. Morrison's hands were light on the yoke, making minute adjustments. Sarah could see the concentration in his face, the way his eyes scanned the instruments, then the horizon, then the runway ahead. This was the moment that separated good pilots from great ones, the ability to maintain perfect control while managing uncertainty. Sarah keyed the radio, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Ground crews, Southwest 447 is now 2 miles out, descending through 2,200 feet. Stand by for visual confirmation pass." The lead ground crew chief's voice came back immediately. "Copy, Southwest 447. We have you in sight. Aircraft is visible, preparing to assess gear configuration." In the tower, Tom Richardson was standing directly in front of the radar scope, his hand resting on the console. He'd been in air traffic control long enough to know when everything was working exactly as it should, when procedures and people aligned perfectly in service of a single objective. This was one of those moments. Every controller was focused, every communication clear, every action precisely coordinated. The aircraft descended through 2,000 feet. Sarah could see the runway clearly now, the threshold markers vivid green and white stripes. The ground was real beneath them now, not just abstract terrain. They were committed to this approach. There would be no turning back. 1 mile from threshold, Lisa Chen reported. 1,800 feet, approach stable. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, calm and focused. Landing gear, still showing primary deployment, backup still intermittent. We're committed to visual confirmation. Sarah leaned forward slightly, though there was nothing more she could visually assess from the cockpit. The ground crews below, they were the ones with the critical vantage point. They could see what the aircraft's sensors couldn't reliably report. "Ground crews," Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone orchestrating a critical operation. "What do you see on the nose gear?" There was a moment of silence, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, an eternity in aviation time. Then the lead ground crew chief's voice came through, clear and unmistakable. "I have visual on the nose gear. Nose gear is down, down and locked. I repeat, nose gear is down and locked." Sarah felt something release in her chest. Not quite relief, because they still had to land, but a profound reassurance that the worst-case scenario had not materialized. "Confirm nose gear down and locked," Sarah repeated, her voice clear on the frequency. "Main landing gear visual status." "Main landing gear confirmed down and locked," the ground crew chief responded. "All 3 wheels showing full extension. Gear configuration is normal for landing." Lisa Chen's voice cracked slightly with emotion. All gear confirmed deployed and locked, proceeding to land. The aircraft was now at 1,200 feet, less than 30 seconds from touchdown. Morrison adjusted the descent rate slightly, setting up for the final portion of the approach. Sarah could feel the aircraft shifting as he fine-tuned the pitch attitude, preparing for flare and landing. Southwest 447, cleared to land, runway 16 left. Bill Chen transmitted from approach control, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment. Southwest 447, cleared to land, Morrison acknowledged. The runway was enormous now, filling the entire forward view. Sarah could see individual runway lights, the taxiway markings, the threshold zone. The aircraft's shadow raced ahead of them on the ground, growing larger as they descended. The speed was perfect, 150 knots, descending smoothly, every instrument showing exactly what it should. At 500 feet, Morrison began the flare, the subtle pitch-up maneuver that transitioned the aircraft from descent to landing attitude. The nose lifted slightly. The rate of descent decreased. The aircraft was transitioning from flying to landing, the wings still generating lift but the trajectory changing to meet the Earth. 300 feet, 200 feet, 100 feet. Sarah could see the runway markings clearly now. The center line, the distance markers, the touchdown zone. Everything was perfect. Everything was aligned. 50 feet. Morrison's hands made final micro-adjustments. The landing gear, now confirmed to be properly deployed, would be the first point of contact with the runway surface. 20 feet. The main landing gear touched down first, the tires meeting the asphalt with a gentle thump that Sarah could feel through the airframe. The aircraft bounced slightly, normal, then settled. The nose gear touched down, contact, the aircraft was on the ground. Reverse thrust roared through the engines as Morrison engaged the spoilers and reversers. The aircraft decelerated smoothly, the runway stretching ahead of them as they slowed from 150 knots to 150 to 30 knots. The wheels rumbled beneath them, the sound of full weight and full speed being transferred to the ground. In the cabin behind them, Sarah could hear the muffled sound of passengers reacting, applause starting tentatively, then building into genuine celebration. They'd felt something significant had occurred, even if they didn't fully understand the technical details. They were alive. They were safe. They were on the ground. The aircraft continued its rollout, Morrison guiding it toward the taxiway at runway 16 left's southern end. Fire trucks were visible rolling alongside the runway, a standard precaution, but clearly there would be no emergency. The landing gear had held. The aircraft was stable. Everything had worked exactly as it should. Southwest 447, reduce speed to taxi speed, Bill Chen instructed from the tower. Southwest 447, taxi speed, Morrison acknowledged, his voice now carrying unmistakable relief. He'd landed successfully with an aircraft that had questionable gear, guided by procedures that had been created ad hoc by an air traffic controller who'd been sitting in seat 7C an hour earlier. As the aircraft slowed to taxi speed, Morrison turned to look back at Sarah. His eyes were intense, grateful, and something more, professional respect between people who just executed something extraordinary. Echo 9, he said quietly, you just helped save this aircraft and everyone on board. Thank you. Sarah felt the weight of what had just happened crystallize inside her. The 7 years of invisible competence had culminated in this single moment. She'd been needed, she'd been essential, and she'd performed exactly as she should have. We did it, she said simply. The aircraft taxied slowly toward the gate, the engine spooling down, the pressure systems equalizing. Around them, Salt Lake City International Airport continued its normal operations, other aircraft taking off, other flights landing, the constant rhythm of commerce and travel and human connection through the air. But for this aircraft, For these 163 passengers, for Sarah Martinez, everything had changed. She was no longer invisible. The gate area at Salt Lake City International Airport was controlled chaos the moment Southwest 447 rolled to a stop. The aircraft had barely finished parking when airport operations personnel, maintenance crews, and FAA inspectors began appearing at strategic points around the gate. Captain Morrison went through the post-landing checklist with mechanical precision, his hands executing procedures that had become automatic through repetition, while around them, the machinery of institutional response activated. Sarah remained in the jump seat, her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash that always followed intense situations. The reality of what had just occurred was beginning to settle over her like a weight. She'd been responsible, in a very real sense, for the safe outcome of this flight. 163 people had landed safely because of decisions she'd helped make, because of expertise she'd spent 7 years cultivating in obscurity. "You should probably go back to the cabin before anyone notices you're still in here," Lisa Chen said gently, a slight smile playing at her lips. "Though I suspect it's already too late for that." Captain Morrison turned to face Sarah directly. "Before you go, I want you to know something. In 37 years of flying, I've worked with hundreds of pilots, handled dozens of emergency situations, and I've never seen anyone handle uncertainty with the clarity and composure you displayed today. You didn't just help us land this aircraft. You showed us what it looks like when expertise meets integrity meets courage. That's rare." Sarah stood on unsteady legs, suddenly aware of how small she was in the cockpit, how the space that had seemed so vast when she arrived now felt intimate and real. "Thank you, Captain, and thank you for trusting me." "Thank you for being on this flight," Morrison said. He extended his hand and Sarah shook it, understanding that they'd become connected by something profound, not just the shared experience, but the recognition of professional excellence. She made her way back through the cabin to her original seat in row 7, and when she emerged, the applause that erupted was unlike anything she'd experienced. Passengers who'd been sitting near her suddenly understood that the quiet woman with the textbook had been instrumental in their survival. Cell phones came out immediately. Videos would be uploaded to social media within minutes. The Denver to Salt Lake City regional flight had just become a national story. But Sarah barely noticed. She was exhausted in a way that transcended the physical. She'd expended something more than energy. She'd expended the accumulated potential of 7 years, converting it into a single moment of necessity. By the time she reached the airport terminal, word had spread through the aviation community. Tom Richardson was waiting for her at the gate, his face a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps vindication that he'd been right about Sarah all along. "Welcome back to the tower," he said, embracing her in a gesture that violated every professional protocol but felt entirely appropriate. "The FAA is already asking for a formal debriefing. You're going to be famous." "I don't want to be famous," Sarah said quietly. "I just want to fly." Tom's expression softened. "Then we'll make sure that happens." The next 3 days passed in a blur of interviews, debriefings, and media attention. Aviation News ran a feature, "The Invisible Controller Who Saved Southwest 447. The FAA published a case study of the emergency procedures. Captain Morrison gave an interview to a major news network where he talked about Sarah's expertise and composure with genuine admiration. Her name, Echo 9, became known throughout pilot circles and the aviation community. But what mattered most happened quietly, in emails and phone calls that accumulated like evidence of transformation. The Aviation Scholarship Foundation for Women reached out directly. They'd heard about her situation, a talented controller with commercial pilot ambitions but insufficient resources. They offered her a substantial grant, $40,000, enough not just for remaining flight hours but for advanced training, instrument certification, and the commercial check ride. "This is extraordinary," Sarah said when she called them back, her voice shaking. No, the Foundation director said firmly. What you did was extraordinary. This is just us recognizing that and supporting excellence when we see it. 3 months later, Sarah sat in the right seat of a Cessna 172, her instructor Mike Patterson in the left seat, as they approached the municipal airport outside Salt Lake City. She was working through her commercial pilot practical exam, the check ride that would transform her from student pilot to licensed commercial aviator. "All right, Echo," Mike said, using the call sign that had followed her from the tower to the sky. "Let's show them what you can do." Sarah guided the aircraft through a series of maneuvers, steep turns, slow flight, stalls, and recoveries. Her hands were steady on the yoke. Her voice was clear on the radio. Every procedure executed with the precision that came from months of preparation and years of understanding. The examiner, a weathered FAA inspector named David Hartley, watched her with careful attention. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct. He simply observed as Sarah demonstrated mastery. The final landing was perfect, smooth, stable, coordinated. As the wheels touched the runway, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion. This wasn't just a check ride. This was the culmination of everything, 7 years of invisible work, the emergency that had crystallized her expertise, the recognition that had followed, and finally, the achievement that she'd been working toward her entire career. When she taxied to the parking area and shut down the engines, the silence that followed felt sacred. "Congratulations, Captain Martinez," David Hartley said, using her new title for the first time. "You just earned your commercial pilot certificate." Sarah became a commercial pilot on a Tuesday in September 2019, exactly 6 months after the emergency landing that had changed everything. She immediately requested assignment to the Denver to Salt Lake City regional route. Her first flight as captain-in-command was on the same aircraft type, flying the same route, departing from the same gate where she'd once boarded as an invisible passenger. When she filed her flight plan, she requested row 7 for her commute flights. And occasionally, when her schedule allowed, she would visit the tower at Salt Lake City International, stopping by to work with her former colleagues, bringing her unique perspective of someone who understood both sides of the radio frequency, the tower's view and the sky's view. Captain Morrison reached out regularly, and they became not just professional colleagues but friends and mentors. He invited her to join a program he was developing to improve pilot-controller communication in emergency situations. Sarah's expertise, her understanding of both disciplines, made her invaluable. Years later, when young pilots asked her about confidence and perseverance, about how to achieve their dreams despite obstacles, Sarah would smile and tell them the story. Not the dramatic version that news outlets had reported, but the real version, about 7 years of invisible competence, about mastering your craft in obscurity, about being ready when opportunity demanded everything you had to give. "I spent 7 years invisible in row 7, she would say, waiting for my moment. I didn't know when it would come or what form it would take, but I was ready because I'd spent every single day becoming the kind of person who could handle it when it arrived." And then she'd add, "The lesson is simple. Excellence isn't about being seen. It's about being essential. When you master your craft completely, when you understand it so deeply that you can improvise and adapt and make critical decisions under pressure, that's when the world stops looking through you and starts looking at you. Not because you demanded attention, but because you earned it." Sarah Martinez, Echo 9, had gone from being invisible in row 7 to being one of the most respected commercial pilots in the region. The quiet woman with the textbook had become the example that others aspired to be. And every time she flew the Denver to Salt Lake route, she looked down at runway 16 left and remembered the moment when her entire life had changed, not because of luck, but because she'd spent 7 years becoming exactly who she needed to be when the world finally needed her. The invisible woman in row 7 had finally become visible, not through seeking attention but through excellence that could no longer be ignored, Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Haiku 4. 5. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.